All right, so here's a tree. Here's a tree, here's a tree, here's a tree. This one here's a tree, here's a tree, and here is a tree. These trees are similar in some ways and different in others, but each one is unmistakably a tree. Now, I like trees. I don't know anything about horticulture or botany or arboriculture and don't have the time for that, but I still like trees. So I'm just going to start making observations and see what happens. So they got leaves, right? And branches and trunks, and some are really big and some are not so big. What if I want to find the biggest tree in the park? Well, biggest, does that mean tallest or widest? Or maybe the widest trees tend to be the tallest trees anyway. Except for these weird skinny pole trees. How about leaf size? What do I do with pine needles? Do I measure the length of the needle or the circumference? Are pine needles even leaves? But what about trees with no leaves? Are there trees with no leaves? Or maybe I could group them by if they lose their leaves in the winter or not, and a special category for trees with blossoms. And what happened to this guy? Say that after I've been doing this for a while, I noticed that trees with needles seem to always have rough bark. So I write that down, needles equals rough bark. But the thing is, it doesn't matter how many thousand times I observe this pairing. I haven't proven the non-existence of a needled tree with smooth bark. I also have done nothing to uncover the mechanism that causes these traits to be correlated. For all I know, them occurring together is a complete coincidence. Making observations and spotting correlations and grouping into categories is fun, but it's not science. I've neither proven nor disproven any hypotheses. I have uncovered nothing about why the trees are showing the traits I have observed, but that doesn't mean that my observations aren't valuable. In the process of grouping the trees into categories, I have observed the trees with a nuance and rigor far above what I would have otherwise. Tree scientist or not, I now have a better sense of the ways that trees are different from one another, and am far more equipped to make a decision about, say, what kind of tree I might like to plant in my yard. Enough about trees. Let's go inside and read a book. This book has a dragon in it. Dragons are not real, so this is a fantasy book. Okay, now let's read this book. Also a book with a dragon, also a fantasy book. But other than the dragon, these books seem pretty different. This one is about a bunch of dudes in search of treasure, while this one has a lot about teenagers and their feelings and relationships. Kinda like this book does, but this book has no dragons or any fantastical elements. Typically, you would call this book young adult fiction. So does that mean this book is also young adult fiction? Can it be that and fantasy? Or maybe it's not YA because it's a children's book, but it's definitely also a mystery, and parts of it read like an action or a thriller or something. And sure, why not? Call this book whatever you want to call it, and it doesn't really matter. It's still the same book. Putting a label on a book does not define it. It doesn't limit it. It's just one adjective that in no way limits what other adjectives might also apply. Knowing that a book is fantasy doesn't mean I can accurately predict much of anything about the book. You can pin as many adjectives as you'd like to a book, and you would never be able to fully explain it that way. I'd still have to read it. But describing books with words is still valuable. What exactly is or isn't a fantasy book may not matter, but the discussion we could have in search of that answer would be worthwhile. Analyzing literature is important, and it changes your relationship with what you are reading. Genre labels are just one set of tools within a much bigger box of literary concepts that help you engage with literature by giving you the language to do so. Knowing and discussing these terms and concepts allows us to engage more deeply and critically with books. Okay, so we got this Carl Jung person, and one day he decides that after all the fun he's had with categorizing trees and books, maybe he should try categorizing human thoughts. What he ends up coming up with is a system of cognitive functions. These are 8 categories into which all mental activity can be sorted. Starting from the top of this flowchart, the first distinction is perceiving versus judging. Everything going on in your head can be categorized as either perceiving or judging. You are either taking in information or you are doing something with that information. Now, I actually prefer the word processing instead of judging, but it starts with the same letters perceiving, and for organization reasons, you don't really want 2 words that start with P, so whatever, you can call them judging functions, but I still think processing is a better word for the concept. So now we have 2 categories of mental activity, and the next step is to break those down into 4. The 2 kinds of perceiving are intuition and sensing. Sensing is your perception of sensory stimuli, and intuition is your perception of intellectual stimuli. And then for processing, the 2 types are thinking and feeling. Thinking is rational-based processing, whereas feeling is processing in terms of values and emotions. From 4 categories, we go one step further to reach our final 8 by having an introverted and extroverted version of each function. So introverted sensing, introverted intuition, extroverted intuition, and so on. Across the board, introverted functions tend to be long-term, internal, and subjective, whereas extroverted functions tend to be immediate, external, and objective. Please note here that these descriptions of introversion and extroversion refer to specific cognitive functions and not to personality types. Now let's briefly dive into individual functions, starting with introverted sensing, or SI for shorthand. hand, this function is typified by comfort seeking, being drawn towards sensory experiences that feel healthy and wholesome, familiar environments, like relaxing by the fire with mom's home cooking. Whereas sensing extroverted would be more about thrill seeking, finding exciting new sensations and wanting to experience everything once, as a stereotype things like skydiving or trying all the exotic foods you can. Introverted intuition tends to be characterized by obsession with a few big ideas, searching for meaning and underlying principles, things like systems design and trying to find the meaning of life, trying to zoom out and look at things from the biggest picture possible. Whereas extroverted intuition seeks the novelty of lots of small ideas and excels at spontaneous creativity. It can look at a situation and see many possibilities. Moving on to introverted thinking, this function is about long-term inductive reasoning. It needs lots of time to sort out its thoughts. It wants to look through massive amounts of data and check for consistency and run calculations on risk and safety over the long term. Whereas thinking extroverted is about immediate deductive reasoning. It's hands-on, logical in the moment. It can construct an argument on the fly. It's obsessed with efficiency and strategy. And finally, with the feeling functions, we have introverted feeling, which values authenticity and integrity. It wants to both value other people and be valued by other people for special individual talents that set them apart as unique. This function has a high value on individuality and self-expression, as opposed to our final function, extroverted feeling, which emphasizes kindness and generosity. This function both values other people and wants to be valued for their contributions to the happiness and well-being of the group as a whole, emphasizing politeness and consideration of other people. You should consider this only a light overview of the functions. I don't want to go into any more depth because I think it's important that you define the functions in a way that makes sense to you. This entire system is entirely arbitrary and there isn't really one correct version you need to understand. You should draw the lines wherever it makes sense for you to draw them, making the categories that feel right to you. So, those are the 8 cognitive functions. Notice that we haven't actually even touched on personality yet. We've just designated 8 different kinds of mental activity. It is with this framework in place that we now build personality types based on one's preferences of cognitive functions. Everyone does have access to all 8 functions. Any given human being is going to find themselves using every one of the functions at some point or another. But people do tend to lean on some functions more than others, and that's where personality typing comes in. A Myers-Briggs personality type is simply a grouping of the functions that one tends to use the most. But there are rules about how the functions fit together. You can't just have someone that has only extroverted functions or only has 2 functions or is such a feeler that their top 2 functions are both feeling functions. It doesn't work like that. The system assumes that we are all complicated, multitude-containing individuals, and so there are rules of balance and symmetry. If it allowed you to just be like, hey, my friend Marcia is super smart, so she must have the thinking functions. Yeah, probably just those. That would sidestep the whole point of making you slow down and challenge your assumptions when considering people's personalities. The rules. Number 1, everyone has 4 functions. Number 2, everyone has a thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuitive function, and only one of each. Number 3, they are ordered in terms of how strongly they manifest. Number 4, functions have to alternate between introverted and extroverted, so you can't have 2 extroverted in a row or vice versa. Number 5, the 2 perceiving functions have to mirror each other, as do the 2 judging. So like you can't have your first and second functions be thinking and feeling. If your first function is feeling, that necessitates that your last function is thinking. Or if your second function is thinking, then your third function has to be feeling. Same goes for sensing and intuitive. You must have balance! And that's it. Those are the rules. If you start putting functions together according to the rules, you will find 16 possible permutations. Those are the 16 personality types of Myers-Briggs. All that's left to do is give them names. The names! Now, if it were me, I would probably just use a shorthand of the names of the functions to refer to the types, because then the name of the type would suggest the function order and the whole system would be much more clear and we'd save a lot of confusion, but whatever, there's an established naming convention and I don't like it, but fine, here it is, damn it. So you start with the first function. Is it introverted or extroverted? That's your first letter, just the direction of your first function. Is it I or E? Next! The second letter is either N for an intuitive or S for sensing. If your sensing function is ranked above your intuitive function, then you're an S. Other way around, you're an N. Next! The third letter is just like the second one, except with T and F for thinking and feeling. You got it. Next! For the last letter, you want to look at your first extroverted function. So if your first function is extroverted, then it's just your first function. But if your first function is introverted, then you drop down to your second function. In either case, you look to your first extroverted function and ask whether it's a judging or perceiving function. In this case, it's sensing, which is a perceiving function, and so your final letter is P. And over here, the first extroverted function is thinking, which is a judging function, and so the last letter is J. And that's it! Okay, so you just want to know what your type is or what your friend's type is, or you probably already think you know your type because that's all everyone cares about is knowing their goddamn type. Well, cut it out! I'm not going to hand you all the answers because I can't. There aren't answers. This system isn't about answers. It's about the process. The cognitive function system is a tool. A tool can help you do the work, but you have to know where and how to use it and put in the effort to turn the wrench. So we got the 8 functions. Look at them! Which one jumps out to you the most as being a core part of who you are? Which one do you relate to the most? That one is probably your first or second function. Alternately, you can drop the terminology and start with words you already use to describe yourself. What do you feel is your defining trait? What do you value most? What about you is the most important? What is your main driver in life? And now take that answer and try to parse out what functions might be involved in that aspect of you. So take whatever function you arrive at first and put it in a slot and start filling in the other slots. Remember the rules! It's like a puzzle. Try stuff out and see what makes sense to you. Maybe you're pretty sure that FI is one of your top functions, but then the corresponding TE seems really foreign to you. Are you sure you're an FI? Does FE seem wrong? Or maybe TE is your 4th function and you just don't notice it that much. I don't know. Play with it. Try out all the combinations until you arrive at what makes the most sense. Or maybe you won't arrive there. Maybe they'll all feel a bit off. That's fine too. This is an arbitrary system built upon arbitrary categories. It's probably not going to fit you perfectly. And even if it does fit you perfectly, you are never done typing yourself. You should be continually analyzing behavior. This is a tool for ongoing introspection and empathy. You are never finished! Okay, so you got this friend and you want to type them. The first thing you know about them that everyone knows about them is that they're really into fashion and makeup. So you figure you'll start there and trying to type them. So which of the 8 functions would you expect to be behind putting effort into your appearance? Let's see. Maybe it's extroverted intuition because they enjoy seeing all the possibilities in altering their appearance and enjoy it as a creatively satisfying hobby. Or maybe it's extroverted sensing because they have the perspective of themselves as a physical being in the external world and want to maximize their own aesthetic value. Or maybe it's a self-expression introverted feeler thing of wanting to project their personality outwards, or maybe it's an extroverted feeling thing of wanting to look presentable so that they fit in, or maybe it's a thinking extroverted thing where they want to use how they look as a strategic advantage when navigating interpersonal spaces, or maybe it's an introverted sensing thing of feeling comfort and security and knowing that they look good. You get the idea. It could be any of them, and probably it's more than one function working together. So how do you know? How do you type them? You ask. You have a conversation with them. Ask them to explain their mental processes behind their decisions. You don't even have to mention that you are trying to type them. In fact, I'd encourage you not to. And maybe at the end of the conversation, you still have no idea what type they are. That's great. Their type doesn't matter. What matters is that you had a conversation in which you sought to understand someone. That's what this is about. It's a tool for encouraging empathy. It's about giving you the terminology and a framework to guide the process of understanding people. It's easy to look at Myers-Briggs and scoff that people are too complicated to be summed up with just 16 categories. And that's correct. I'm not saying that there are only 16 types of people. I'm saying that it's useful to sort the infinite types of people into 16 categories, and that having a model of the world that includes 16 different types of people is a whole lot better than a model that only has one. Without conscious intervention, it's really easy to just assume that everyone is more or less like you. You see someone doing something that you would not do and say, hey, that person is doing a thing that does not make sense. They must be stupid. What I like about this system is that it's a reminder that people are different, that they are making the choices that make sense to them based on value systems which might be very different than mine. And at the same time, it's a reminder that people are complicated. Consistently asking myself which cognitive functions are responsible for someone's behavior is a really good way to keep in mind that people contain multiple competing forces. Because the thing is, you don't get to choose whether or not you have a model. You do. You can't help it. Your brain is going to spot patterns and oversimplify and misimagine and make bad predictions. That's what brains do. You don't get to turn that off, but you can try to consciously counteract it. You can leave your modeling of other people to your subconscious mind and all of the biases it's prone to, or you can choose to bring the process out into the light and do this intentionally. Cough!